You know, I think the obvious question, at least on my mind, is it's hard to understand how Wall Street can be soaring, and I mean soaring, when it seems like America is going over a cliff. Over 90 million Americans are underemployed and unemployed, record number on food stamps, little economic growth, and yet Wall Street is just absolutely pushing to the clouds. Some of this has to do with low interest rates. Some of this has to do with the Federal Reserve. Why don't you help analyze it for my listeners?
Sure. Jan, you know, we're looking at one of the lowest participation rate in the economy in terms of people actively at work that we have seen since the Great Depression back in the 1920s and early 30s. One of the reasons we're seeing, and as a matter of fact, the main reason that we are seeing Wall Street continue to run to record highs, despite the fact that the underlying fundamentals in looking at what should normally make Wall Street go, you look at the raw numbers, they don't support where we see the Dow and all of the other indexes. But what we have learned in looking at the strategy that's been implemented by the Federal Reserve, as you mentioned, in putting together this low interest rate strategy, by default, the only place investors have to go to make money is to put their money in the stock market. You can go to the bank, and the national average on bank CDs for a one-year CD are really a joke today.
I know.
And if you look at the different places people have as a way to position their dollars to have an opportunity for growth, this strategy has done one thing, and it has forced people to put money into the market because that's really the only place an investor can go right now to try to find an opportunity to grow their money.
Okay, but you told me that you do expect a major correction up ahead.
Yes, I do. I believe, and there's a number of, matter of fact, over the last several days, probably starting in mid-June, early July, we started seeing a number of economists start making some statements in the Wall Street Journal and on Market Watch and several different places, is that the numbers that Wall Street is showing and the economic uncertainty that we see is going to result in some type of correction. I mean, if you look at the numbers, the Dow has almost gone straight up for a period of time. And anytime we see that particular run-up, some point in time, just like a balloon, it's going to run out of air and it's got to return to the ground. Most of the economists are predicting a return to at least 15,000. I mean, the last numbers that we were looking at were in the 17,000 range. Some others believe we could see as much as a 20 to a 25% reduction in the overall pricing of the stock market simply to get it back to closer to what we call a fair value.
Everything, John Terry, is costing more. I mean, groceries, housing, rent, gasoline, big-ticket items, all of them. You expect this inflation spiral then to continue or even get worse?
I personally expect the inflation spiral to continue. The problem we have, and again, we've got government manipulation in the numbers. If you'll notice what's called the Consumer Price Index, that is the measuring stick that is published by our leaders in Washington, D.C., to talk about the increasing in price of different items that we buy. And they publish a number that says inflation is at 3% or inflation is at 2%. That number is based upon measuring different benchmarks. But as we've previously talked about on your radio show, Jan, the CPI numbers exclude food and they exclude energy, which are the two most volatile sections of the overall economy. We're seeing food prices continually rise. I know my wife, every time she goes to the store, she comes back and makes a comment that we're seeing meats and grains and vegetables and everything that we buy for consumption in food items growing at an astronomical rate. We're seeing fuel prices at some of the highest fuel prices that we as a nation have ever seen, all directly related to a couple of things. One of those is this low interest rate environment that we're in and the fact that we're printing money through the Fed at an alarming rate. And as these dollars leave the Federal Reserve System and they get into the economy, that's more dollars chasing the same item. You know, it's really the fundamental law of when you print a lot of money, it devalues every dollar in the system.
Sure.
So it takes more dollars to buy the same item.
Okay, John Terry, let's just talk practical terms right now for the next couple minutes. How can listeners battle this? How can they battle not only there's no interest money out there, inflation is going to be soaring, and not all of that inflation, as you have just said, is even reported on as major categories are left out. Give us some practical practical advice for coping with one of the most weird economies that I have ever lived through.
Jan, one of the things I would immediately tell your listeners today is if they are not, as Scripture reminds us, counting the costs, and they have not put themselves on a budget to manage the resources God is putting into their hands every month through the employment that they have, and they are not looking at how they're spending their dollars. I know from a lot of research that we've done with our organization and a number of different other organizations, many consumers today, and a lot of your listeners, do not pay attention to how much money they spend. When you go to the grocery store, you should have a list of the items you should need, and you should pre-plan your meals and buy according to that pre-planned list. Most people going to the grocery store buy what they normally do. They eat what they want with no regard to how they're spending their money, and they can typically save anywhere from 12 to 18, as much as 20% of their food cost if they would begin to plan a budget and plan a budgeted meal system that I'm going to eat this for breakfast, this for lunch, this for supper, and they would begin to manage those resources, much like Joseph did during the time of famine that we saw in Egypt, where Joseph stepped in and said, we are going to account for all of the grain in Egypt, and then we're going to disperse that as needed so that we make sure that we stay in control of the resources we have. Another area where consumers can step in, there is an election coming up. One of the main ways that your listeners can help change the tone in Washington is to look at changes to the leadership that is there, because the leadership drives all of the ramifications of all of the laws that they pass that we're under. And the only way those laws can be changed is if we get leadership in there that is willing to fight, and we get rid of this corruption that's in Washington, D.C., where we have people that are involved in all of these issues that we have, and they continue to be elected over and over and over again, and they will not stop because they get addicted to the money, they get addicted to the power, and it becomes more about sustaining their own political future than it is about doing right for the people that they elect. Right for the